what I want to talk about right now is my own speech in English within English, and it's interesting because it's not very interesting. That's my philosophy with a lot of things. What I'm going to do is I'm going to look through a few registers of my speech, because over my life I've noticed 4 different registers. I have sort of a formal register, and everyone has this. Everyone has multiple registers of speech that they use in varying levels of formality and around varying people, or around different people. I've been around a lot of different accents in my lifetime. I grew up in the country, in a place that I'm going to call Jafton, because it's just a fuck ton of nothing out there. So I come from rural WA, in a place I'm going to call Jafton, right in the middle of nowhere. And I didn't live in town, I lived on a station away as well, so I was sort of linguistically isolated within that as well, and that's why I have a few irregularities in my speech. From that station, when I was about 12, I moved into the city, into a boarding house in the city. You get this little bubble, which is sort of various very broad, very rural accents, all contained in this one space. And I lived there for about 5 years, and then I've since moved out of there into an urban area, and I'm around people with, again, a different accent, which is more like general standard West Australian English. And so over the course of these 3 different sort of locations that I've lived, I've developed 3 sort of registers. You've got the 2 broad ones, which are one from Jafton, and then one which is sort of an amalgamation of various regional broad accents that was in the boarding house, and then the 3rd one, which is my natural speech. And then on top of that, there's a 4th one, which I think is the most universal, which is just formal speech. And there's a few patterns of my formal speech compared to my natural speech, which I think are interesting, and I'll start with my formal speech. Not only do my facial expressions and gestures and everything become more vivid, that's purely just a masking thing. I'll put up a whatever on the bottom of the screen now to explain what I'm talking about there. But my intonation and my facial expressions and my gestures become a lot more exaggerated. There's another thing on top of it though, and that's a sort of articulation in my T's. If I'm speaking in this formal sort of register, I'll say butter or better. It's certainly far better than that. It's, I think, a good example of it. A good example. There's generally 2 kinds of Australian accent, and this is just a very oversimplified way of looking at it, but I find there are 2 kinds of Australian accent. There's people who say dance and people who say dance. And for me, I've sort of grown up in a combination of environments where some people will say dance and some people will say dance. But when I'm in my formal register, I find I often say dance. And I think it comes from a sort of presupposition I have. Don't know if that's the right word, but anyway. That accents that say graph and dance and laugh and have that very that very not backed, but not in my accent at least, but sort of relatively backed long vowel, the R vowel. I find that very posh, and I think that's due to a cognitive association with received pronunciation, the posh sort of received pronunciation of grass and dance. And so I think this pattern of me saying grass and dance an example instead of grass and dance an example is sort of subconsciously motivated by that association of formality that comes with that sort of long R vowel. So there's, of course, stereotyping going on in my subconscious, but oh well. And so that's the phonetic difference of my formal register, really. Aside from the, exaggerated intonation, the main 2 things that I notice are the choice of the R over the R, that vowel choice, and also better instead of better. That sort of a weird subconscious association with poshness that comes with water instead of water in my speech. And then we move on to my natural speech, and my natural speech is different this is different from posh speech in a number of ways, obviously. I say posh speech, formal speech. Sorry, there's just a fuck ton of mozzies out here. My natural register of speech is different in a number of ways. First of all, I have a weird tendency to alternate between that vowel distinction that I mentioned earlier between dance and dance. I'll say I want to plant a tree. That's natural to me. I want to plant a tree. But if I'm describing detritus, then I'll say detritus is made up of decomposing whatever, and it usually consists of a lot of plant matter. For some reason, I switched to plant matter instead of plant matter. I vary completely between those two vowels in words like dance and not in things like graph. I consistently say graph as a long R, but things like plant an example, and I think it's to do with nasals. I think it switches to instead of R before nasals. Only sometimes, though. Oh no, I think always. I don't know, I'll put something on the bottom of the screen now to explain it. And I think it's to do with vowel harmony, like I said, obviously not actual vowel harmony, but like I'll say plant matter because the a in plant is much closer to the a in matter. I think the natural form of the word in my accent is plant, but in proximity to an a vowel, it becomes plant. And so it's a weird sort of influence that my boarding house days have carried over, where I use the a instead of the r, but it only carried over in certain conditions. And I think as I get older and as I get temporally further and further away from those boarding house years, it's going to disappear from my speech again. There's some things about my accent that I think might be atypical of a normal, like, West Australian accent, and something that's definitely American English influence, and something that I get ridiculed endlessly for, is that I say passive instead of passive, because apparently it's normal to say passive, and apparently that's what everyone says is passive. My family especially always catch me up on it and say that I'm speaking posh when I say passive. And the reason I say passive is because I learnt the word passive from American YouTube videos. And I learned it through, like, I'm watching some Minecraft mod review, and the words that they use in Minecraft for the different monsters you encounter are hostile and passive and passive. And of course in American accent that's hostile and passive.
I created this system to make passive mobs hostile towards the player.
And so when I heard passive in an American accent, I did the normal transition that I often do with the ass sound in America. And so it's like plant, laugh, crap, sort of the plant and dance. That distinction, I'll use those two words again because they're good for it. Plant and dance in American. And in British English and West Australian English, my dialect of West Australian English, if you transition plant and dance for an American accent into plant and dance, then you end up with the R vowel. And so I heard passive and wrongly assumed that pattern of plant and plant also applied to passive and passive. And so I ended up saying passive, and that's just how I grew up pronouncing the word, because it's not a word that you hear in common speech. And then when I got older, my siblings all made fun of me for saying passive. I'll put a little thing on the bottom if there actually is a strict pattern of what causes passive versus pass, and why me saying passive is wrong or non-standard, really. Look at me trying to defend myself. Most of what I use that's like weird or non-standard is vocabulary, though, and most of it also comes from either American or that boarding house influence. And so what is American is definitely my distinction between cookie and biscuit. What has appeared in my speech is an actual semantic distinction between a cookie and a biscuit, and I don't quite know what that is. I think that a cookie is always sweet, whereas a biscuit can be sweet, but it can be a lot less sweet than a cookie. Something like a chocolate chip biscuit / cookie is objectively a cookie in my mind, because it's sweet and it has that sort of ethereal cookie quality. I mean, Americans call it a cookie all the time, and so that's probably a bit of influence from America as well. But then you get Arnott's biscuits, I always call them biscuits. And there is an actual semantic distinction between the two, and I'm not really sure what that is, but I'll think about it, and then when I've figured out what it is, I'll put it at the bottom of the screen right now. Well, actually a little bit ago, because right now it would suck. Another thing that I do, which is completely non-standard and is not a regional feature of anywhere except for my household, is I'll say brush and shovel instead of dustpan and brush. And when I come to the city and I'm talking to people in Perth and I say, where's your brush and shovel? They'll look at me weirdly for a second and then say, do you mean the dustpan and brush? And I don't know why, but the word dustpan has completely disappeared from my family's vocabulary. I mean, it's not. They know what it is, but like it's fallen out of household usage is what I'm saying. In that little bubble out in the middle of the desert, it stopped being spoken. Another weird thing that's just from my household is horsey paper instead of paper towel, and people always give me weird looks for that, and that's a lot simpler to figure out. We call it horsey paper because we come from the station and we don't all have horses, but we have lots of horses around. Horses are a part of day-to-day life, and it's a funny thing to say that the paper towel is horsey paper, i.e. toilet paper for horses. I'm very sorry, I didn't mean to break your ears. I'm sorry, I'm fidgeting around with my legs because I'm still being eaten alive by mosquitoes. Mosquitoes? That's not normal for me, I say mosquitoes. The one thing about my speech that I actually do find interesting is that I'll say tis, and this comes from my dad, and my dad speaks nothing like my mum. My dad has a really broad, rural Australian accent.
And if you look at the trees on the other side of the road now, where the water used to flow and now it can't, it's been cut off by the road being built up, and the road's built up, I would suggest maybe 30 centimetres.
And something that he does say, which is unheard of in normal Perth English and like general Australian and cultivated Australian and anything like that, and in most dialects of British English I've heard as well, is tis. We still use the abbreviation of it is as tis, but what makes it interesting, at least in my speech, is that I only use it under two very specific circumstances. And it's sort of like verum focus. And if you don't know what verum focus is, it's like, if it's like someone will ask me, "It's Wednesday today, isn't it?" And I'll say, "Yes, it is." Or someone would say, "Yes, it is." The emphasis is on yes, but if we take yes out of it, then we go, "It's Wednesday today, isn't it?" And you'll say, "It is." The focus is on is, and there's definitely something different about the way you say "it is," rather than like under normal circumstances where you just abbreviate it to "it's." And what that difference is the fact that you're focusing on the fact that it is rather than it isn't. You focus on the fact that it is positive or negative. It either is or isn't. You put focus on that, and that is called verum focus. And what I do is I use tis. One of the two situations that I use it in is for verum focus. And it's strange, it's really weird. But if someone asks me, "Is it Wednesday today?" and the answer is yes, then I'll say tis instead of it is. I'll only say it is if I say like yes beforehand, like yeah it is. But if I'm just saying it is by itself, it'll always be tis. And so that's one use of tis, and another is like when it's similar to verum focus, but it's not verum focus, and I don't actually know the proper word for this. But if someone says, I'll just give you an example and demonstrate it through that. Someone will say, "That's an awful lot of wheels," and I'll say, "Yeah, tis a road train." I use tis in that situation when I'm sort of like emphasizing the fact that, yeah, it is a road train. Obviously, it's going to have lots of wheels. That circumstance is the only other situation where I use tis. And so tis is really specific and really weird, and I think it's interesting. And I don't know why I'm telling you, because you're not interested, and there's nothing really in this that you can get from it. It's sort of like an information marking. I've sort of integrated information marking into my speech using a fossilized term, which I don't use anywhere else in my vocabulary. If I sit here, oh my god, I'm in a floodlight. Oh my god, I look terrible in this lighting too. Okay, I'm just gonna... I looked at that image of Germa going like... When I was in the boarding house, I spoke like this. I had diphthong flattening. I really raised up my vowels. I said vowel. I said the absolute worst vowel change that I underwent in this place was mouth. I said, instead of saying mouth or house, I said mouth and house. I'll always pick the a vowel over the r vowel when I'm saying things like plant and dance. I'll always say that. There was also just like the elision of things like boarding house, instead of boarding house, like the just sort of meddling, slurring, whatever you want to call it, of those syllables. Oh, is there a bandicoot behind me? Or a dude? Could be anything. I actually did catch a mosquito just then. That was so cool. Tis a rat. Tis a little bandicoot. Awesome. I said the tis. The main difference, though, in my boarding house dialect is with vocabulary. Things I'll say roll, like I do in my natural speech. Roll is just sort of a carry-on from boarding that'll probably fall away as I get older. Instead of saying that something is lies, I'd say it's cap. And I'm pretty sure that's a direct loan from African American English that's been like sort of transferred from that way of speech. My hand is so bright here. I hate it looks so weird. I'll gesticulate with this hand. That's sort of come from African American English into the internet, and then come from the internet and like TikTok and everything into the boarding house, and everyone started using cap. It's a relatively recent thing, like within the last 3 or 4 years. And I'm sure that if you went back into that same boarding house now, it would have fallen out of fashion. The other two things are mad as an intensifier and fangus. Now, there's a common thing in rural Australian English where instead of saying me, you'll say us. Give us a look, or, give us a taste, or something like that. Whereas in standard English, you would say give me. Fang is obviously just like a stand-in for give in fangus. But where fang itself comes from, and it's sort of like, it has semantic connotations of more like throwing. If someone throws something across the room, or like throws something and it smacks into a wall, they fanged it across the room, they fanged it at the wall. And so I think that's where it comes from, is that it was originally used to just mean throw, and then it spread to also mean give. The last register of speech that I need to discuss is Jafton. In Jafton's middle of nowhere, there's obviously going to be some linguistic or weirdness. I spoke the Jafton dialect or whatever in very specific context, and that was when I was at the school. I think people exaggerated their broadness of their accent and used the slang purely just because it was it helped people fit in to the groups at school, and that's definitely why I spoke it. And I'm not really, this is the one register of speech that I can't replicate now. But now I can say the quick brown fox jumped over the lazy dog in my normal accent, and then broad boarding house accent is the quick brown fox jumped over the lazy dog. But then I can't really fall into my Jafton accent anymore, just because it's been so long since I used it, and in the first place when I did use it, it was so sparse. But I do remember vocabulary very well, and I do remember some phonemic things as well. This is the one that's most phonemically different from any other accent, and I think that's probably because it's the most geographically removed and historically removed from all of the other places. The main thing is the use of light L, like alveolar L, with no velarization consistently. I'll say, I'll use light L and dark L, and I'll say milk, I'll velarize it before consonants, and I'll also velarize it before back vowels. Willing, I'll use a light L, but then wallaby, I'll velarize it. And so I use it allophonically, but then in Jafton English, every L is a light L. I'm doing this a lot. I think it's a nervous tick. An additional thing about the vowels was that whereas in boarding house, I would say house, and I would flatten the diphthong, in Jafton English, you would sort of exaggerate the diphthong almost. You would say house, or mouth, or stuff like that. It was much more exaggerated. There was some diphthongs that are characteristic of broad Australian English, like fleece, where it starts as a schwa and then moves up. And so that sort of exaggeration of that diphthong was also very prevalent, and that's the one that's more standard, whereas house is typically flattened into house in broad Australian English. So there's a thing that Jafton seems to have been unique in. Something that was also popular, at least in my little region of Jafton English, was using r instead of r. So that's the, I think, labiodental approximant instead of the normal r sound, the normal alveolar approximant. So ran, brother. As I said before, the most distinct thing about Jafton English is the vocabulary. So there's words that are out there that are sort of more common than they are in the city. 2/3 or half of the population of Jafton is Aboriginal because it's a rural country town. The native people to Jafton are the Buddy Maya people, and what you'll find in a lot of the Jafton speech in the register that I'm talking about specifically is loan words from Buddy Maya and from Wadri, and sort of Yamaji languages like that. If you talk to a person from the country in West Australia, you say a bungara, they'll instantly know you're talking about a goanna, whether it's a sand goanna or an Argus monitor or anything like that. They'll know what you're talking about. You're talking about a bungara. But when I go to the city and say bungara, no one knows what I mean. So it's a loan word from the Katu, from the Yamaji languages. Around Jafton and around my station, it meant parenti, and elsewhere it meant an Argus monitor and a sand monitor. It sort of meant all sort of different but very similar at the same time species of monitor lizard that live out there. And so that's been inherited into Jafton English and other parts of rural Western Australia as sort of a loan word that's convenient, because that lizard exists out there, and it's a lot easier to remember to say bungara than it is to say Argus monitor or yellow spotted monitor or sand goanna or Gould's monitor or anything like that. And I think a lot of it is because Gould's monitor and Argus monitor sound very distant, and there's the attachment of some white European dude naming the lizard and having his name attached to the lizard, whereas if you use the native Yamaji word bungara, it has a lot of identity behind it, And I think that's a big part of the motivating factor of actually using it over alternatives. Guna is another Yamaji loan word, and I think it's also in Noongar as well, and it means excrement, it means shit. And people would say they're going for a guna, and it's more common in the station areas where they've had historically more contact with Yamaji people speaking Yamaji languages. And same like Noongar people that I've heard Noongar people say guna as well.
And then when they go for guna, that's when that fruit and the new growth of that plant would have been somewhere else.
Two other not particularly uncommon words are dari to mean awesome and bash to mean like fight or attack. And bash is distinct from roll in my mind, whereas bash only implies like an attack. Roll implies an actual like theft as well. There's also the word balai. And balai is a strange word because no one in the city knows it, and very few people outside of Jafton know it as well. Like, it's obviously a thing in Aboriginal Australian English, much more widespread than it is in, like, whitefella English. I didn't know it was a thing outside of Jafton until relatively recently. But yeah, balai is used by my dad because he had lots of contact with the Yamaji people when he was younger, like working on the station, and also with the kids in town at the school speaking Jafton dialect because, you know, lots of Yamaji kids in the town itself. And so balai comes from Budimai specifically, and it's got cognates and wadri and all that. But what it means is look out. Balai was the original pronunciation, and then that sort of got adapted into English and simplified into balai. The only people I'd heard say it, besides me and my friends in Jafton, was my dad for the longest time. So it's not a common word, but it's still like it's prevalent and people know it. The most interesting thing about Jafton English, though, is conjugation of like the inflection of pronouns and of verbs. So for pronouns, you had use as a plural pronoun, and that's a thing in like England as well. And it's sort of like everyone in Australia has heard use before, and it's generally looked down upon as one of those things that's like only uneducated or poor or whatever people say use. To be honest, it's very useful. It's the equivalent of y'all in American English. Like, plural forms of you are useful, and that's becoming increasingly noticeable where all over the world people are coming up with different ways of altering you to become a plural form. And then there's them twos, which is a really weird construction, but I never heard it them threes, only them twos, and I think that inclination for the dual, like singular, dual, plural sort of distinction where it was like them is singular and then them twos is dual, and there wasn't really a them threes or them fours, it just went straight to them. Straight back to them twos. I feel like that inclination towards that comes from the local Yamaji languages having a dual pronoun, and so Yamaji people learning English would have been inclined to make that 1-2 plural distinction when speaking English. And I feel like the them twos as a construction in Jafton English is a result of that substrate. Another thing I noticed about Jafton English was that the plural distinction in things like them and those and things like is and are didn't really like live on very far. People would say like them twos is, use is, whatever. Same with those. People would typically replace those with them and sort of use it as in place of those in almost every circumstance. And I can't think of any exceptions to those rules of people using are or those. But I'm sure they did exist. I'm sure that like it did happen, and I'm sure that it's more in-depth and complicated than I'm making it out to be. It's a common thing in English everywhere already, I think, to say brang instead of brought, and I don't really know where that originates from, but I think it's just a common thing, like, sing to sang. Surely bring to brang makes more sense than bring to brought. And so, yeah, brang is common, but Jafton's the only place I've ever heard brung. I think that there is actually a participle distinction in Jafton, where people would say, I brang it to school, and then I've brung it. I think that there is actually a past participle distinction between brang and brung, which doesn't exist at all with bring. Have brung and I brought it and I have brought it are both the same construction in standard English. So they've created a distinction between brang and brung, like as there is between sing, sang, and sung. They've done that with bring, brang, and brung instead of just bring and brought. And I think that's very interesting. There's also past tense of write is writ. And even though that is a thing like old archaic English, it's re-emerged as its own thing in Jafton English to say writ as the past tense of write, like he writ it down. The one that my mum loves to point out is bait. There's a past tense of beat to say like we were in a running race and I bait him. And it's just like, because of course, why would beat be both present and past? That doesn't make much sense. So of course you would change beat in some way to end up with a new past tense form, which is bait. And so that's another like innovation, really, that Jafton English has created that sort of fixes a patch of ambiguity in standard English. But it's like, I don't know, it's another non-standard thing that's looked down upon in a way that I don't think it should be. No one asked for this much of an in-depth explanation of my accent, because no one cares. This has no application to anything, but my thinking is, I've had this YouTube channel sitting around for ages and I want to make something of it, and so just as a bit of filler, in between whatever my last video was, like a year ago or something, and then whatever my next video was going to be, just to sort of fill it up and make it seem like the channel's not completely dead, I'm going to make a video that's just this, sort of Simon Roper sit down in a chair looking all shaggy, and talk about whatever. You like my lighting setup where I've just got, that's, oh my god, that's really bright, isn't it? I've literally got like a torch hung up in a tree. Over there. Oh my god, why am I doing that? No, I keep forgetting I'm audioing on. I'm just gonna stop recording the audio right now. Okay, yeah, audio's done. I'm back to whatever this is. Yeah, so have fun. Do whatever. I don't have an outro.